Warden Clinton Duffy appeared in the door of the death house cell a few minutes before 10 in the morning. He asked the occupant if she was ready. Prisoner 35692, a plump middle-aged woman, looked up from the cot where she sat. Her violet eyes met his. She smiled warmly and told him that she'd been ready for a long time. Duffy detected the faint scent of perfume, Chanel No. 5 to be exact. In the years to come, whenever he caught a trace of the popular fragrance favored by Marilyn Monroe, he associated it to the condemned woman, and it made him shudder. Prisoner 35692 rose from the cot and straightened her brown and tan print dress. She stood 5 feet 2 inches tall and looked about as dangerous as a spinster in a sewing circle. The warden asked whether she had changed her mind about wearing the hood, but she calmly reaffirmed that she did not wish to wear one. She had also refused the sedatives offered to calm her for what was to come. Warden Duffy acknowledged her decision and indicated that it was time to proceed. He escorted the prisoner on her last mile to the gas chamber, which was 20 feet away. Following them were 2 associate wardens, 2 nurses, and 2 doctors. A crowd of 79 witnesses and 12 prison guards was already assembled in the viewing area. The gas chamber was a metal monstrosity that seemed to have sprung from the mind of Jules Verne during a fever dream. The large windows in its octagonal hull gave it a fishbowl effect. The entourage stopped before the death chamber as the guards spun the 5-spoked hand wheel and swung the bank vault-style door open to reveal 2 metal seats inside, one marked A and the other B. Warden Duffy turned to face his prisoner one last time. He quietly instructed her that when she heard a thud, she should count to 10 and take a deep breath, assuring her it would make the ordeal easier. The condemned woman acknowledged his advice with a smile and said thank you. Straightening her back, the woman, soon to be the second of her sex to die in California's gas chamber, stepped into the device with the same ease as if she were getting into a taxi. Death did not frighten her. Death was her only faithful companion throughout an eventful life, and she was ready to be taken into its everlasting embrace. She saw through the glare in the plexiglass the ghostly faces of the people who came to watch her die. Their expressions were a mixture of shame, fear, and self-righteousness. As prisoner 35692 was strapped into the seat marked B, a smile appeared on her ruby lips. She knew from that day forward the world would forever remember the name Louise Peete. The door to the chamber swung closed and was secured. Then there seemed to be a long intermission where all she could hear was the electric fan. No thud, no hiss of gas. Turning her head, she made eye contact with Warden Duffy through the window, and even though she knew he couldn't hear her voice, she said, "Let's go." A moment later, she heard a metallic sound. It was 3 minutes past 10 in the morning, and the twice convicted murderess began her countdown. Evil walks among us in both shadow and in light. We may come face to face with it every day without knowing, without suspecting just how close we came. Evil does not present itself in the guise of devils. More often it greets us with a gentle smile and soft words to hide its dark intentions. Such was the woman at the center of our next tale. With the hypnotic charm of a viper, she lured victims who could feed her voracious appetite for luxury, wealth, and beautiful things. Whether by her own hand or through calculated manipulation, she was responsible for the destruction of no fewer than 6 human beings. Yet she went to her death in the gas chamber without ever expressing remorse or acknowledging guilt for any of them. Come walk with me as we explore the life and deaths of Louise Peete. Jacob Charles Denton, who had made a fortune in mining, bought the large Tudor Revival house at 675 Catalina Street in Los Angeles, intending it to be the home for himself and his beloved wife, Dolly Mae. Tragically, however, Dolly Mae died unexpectedly of pneumonia at age 28, a month before they were to move in. Now alone, the widower hoped to assuage his grief by going on an extended trip to see family and attend to business in the East. Expecting to be away for several months, he listed the house for rent, and on May 25th, a woman appeared at his door as a prospective tenant. So striking was the alluring stranger's resemblance to his dead wife that when Denton first set eyes on her, he thought he was seeing a ghost. She was in her mid-30s, pretty, and had a refined manner. Her eyes were perhaps her most striking feature. They were the rarest blue that in certain light took on a pale violet hue that seemed to hide something mysterious and dark. She introduced herself as Louise Peete from Denver, but she spoke with a diluted southern accent of someone of Creole descent. Denton took to the woman from Denver immediately, and she soon moved into his Catalina Street home. Although accounts differ as to her role in his life, it was generally reported that she was his live-in maid, a claim that Louise flatly denied. Whatever her role might have been, they didn't remain under the same roof for long. Sometime on or about June 1st, Jacob Denton vanished, and the only person who seemed to have any notion where he had gone was the mysterious violet-eyed stranger who was living in his house and quietly managing his affairs. As questions about her landlord's whereabouts mounted, Louise gave conflicting and far-fetched answers, hinting that she knew more than she was letting on. By September, it had been nearly 4 months since anyone had seen or heard from Jacob Denton. His family had been quietly pushing local authorities who were slow to act. Finally, Frances Denton, the mining speculator's daughter from his first marriage, hired a Phoenix law firm hoping they could get some answers. The lawyers brought in private investigator A.J. Cody, who on September 23rd made a shocking discovery. By then, the tenants living at 675 Catalina Street were Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Miller and their 4 children. They'd been in the 11-room home for just over a month, having sublet it from the previous occupant. With her husband away on business and the children in school, Mrs. Miller was alone when Detective Cody arrived at her door on that Thursday morning. When he explained that he was investigating the disappearance of the owner, Mrs. Miller allowed him into the house, and at first everything seemed to be in order. She told the detective that she had never met Mr. Denton, and that she had transacted the lease from a Mrs. R.C. Peete, to whom she paid the first month's rent. Curiously, she added, Mrs. Peete, whom she understood was in Denver, had not yet come to collect for the second month. Finishing the search of the house, Detective Cody moved to the basement. Descending the narrow stairs into the dark cellar, he noticed a stark change in the atmosphere. The air was heavy and sour like that of a sick room. On the first inspection, nothing of great interest presented itself until the detective noticed a crudely boarded-up space beneath the stairs. Mrs. Miller said she had never looked inside and didn't know what was there. Giving him permission to open the space, Detective Cody used a pry bar to remove the wood. Inside, he found a 3-foot-tall mound of loose earth covered in debris. The detective turned to Mrs. Miller, who was watching with interest. Using one of the loose boards, Cody began to dig. It wasn't long before his makeshift shovel connected with something solid. Clearing away more dirt, he uncovered the unmistakable shape of a man's body wrapped in a blanket. As everything suddenly came into focus, the color drained from Mrs. Miller's face. She let out a choking sound that was between a gasp and a scream when she realized that lying at her feet were the decaying remains of Jacob Charles Denton. Following the discovery of Denton's remains, the Los Angeles DA with the police and sheriff's department descended on the quiet Wilshire District neighborhood like an invading army. A preliminary examination of the body did not reveal a cause of death. However, the body was so badly decomposed that the only means of identification was through a ring and a belt buckle that Denton was known to own. As the story broke, hundreds of onlookers gathered at the scene. One of them was James Crowhurst, a 34-year-old plumber and handyman who claimed to have built the enclosure where the body was discovered. He admitted to being in possession of a small gold ring inscribed with the initials JD that he had a jeweler change to match his own. Crowhurst, as it turned out, was also an ex-con on parole from San Quentin, where he'd been serving a 7-year sentence for robbery. Without any other leads, the police took the plumber into custody for questioning. The next day, he swore out an affidavit that laid out how he was hired in early June by Louise Peete to work on the boiler. When the work was finished, Mrs. Peete asked him to seal off the space beneath the stairs. Crowhurst agreed to do the work and remarked about the mound of fresh dirt. Peete told him that was where she had buried Mr. Denton's valuable household liquor. When asked why she felt the need to hide it in such a manner, Peete confided that Denton had many enemies, including his family, who were always coming to the house after money or whatever they could get their hands on. She said they were ruthless people and that she believed they were capable of anything. Furthermore, she added that she lived in fear of them. Crowhurst was paid $4.50 for the work and given some of Denton's old clothing. It was in the pocket of one of those garments that he found the ring. It was not the first time, nor would it be the last, that police heard the name Louise Peete. According to several witnesses, she was the only one who had any contact with Denton after June 2nd. Furthermore, she told varying accounts as to where he was, and much of it revolved around a nameless and mysterious Spanish woman. This made Mrs. Peete the #1 person of interest, and the Los Angeles police wanted to talk to her immediately. However, they learned from Crowhurst and others that she had returned to Denver over a month earlier. Word was sent to the Mile High City to put Mrs. Peete under round-the-clock surveillance until they could think of some way to bring her back to L.A. On October 2nd, Louise Peete, her husband Richard, and their 4-year-old daughter Elizabeth boarded a train in Denver bound for Los Angeles. She'd been under extreme pressure to return to the city to clear up some nagging details about the Denton case. She understood that she was the prime suspect, but in her mind the police were no wiser than the Keystone cops, and she was confident that she could make them see things her way, just like she could everyone else. What she didn't realize was that it was exactly what they wanted her to believe. Detectives had quietly been building a case against her, and she was walking right into their trap. What they had in mind for her became shockingly clear on October 4th, when her train made its scheduled stop in the sleepy high-desert town of Victorville, California. Deputies from the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office swarmed onto her Pullman car and whisked Louise and her family away. They were transported by automobile to a hotel in La Crescenta, about 15 miles north of downtown LA, where Louise was placed under house arrest. Frightened and outraged, she accused the DA of kidnapping. There was much she had to answer for, and the grilling went on for hours. Some of the evidence held by the DA included 2 canceled checks drawn on Denton's account totaling nearly $1,000. Both were proven to have been forged in her handwriting. Louise was even suspected of forging a will dated May 15, 1920, in which Denton supposedly expressed concern that his life was in danger. Multiple witnesses went on record alleging that Louise sold many of Denton's valuables and attempted to enlist others to sell items on her behalf. She was accused of going on spending sprees in several LA department stores, purchasing gowns with lines of credit that she opened in the victim's name. One prominent businessman revealed that she had offered to let him name his price for Denton's expensive Pierce Arrow automobile. Perhaps her boldest move came when she tried to officiate the sale of the Catalina Street house, only to abandon the scheme once she realized she couldn't prove she had power of attorney. Whenever she was asked why the owner wanted to get rid of his belongings, she responded, Mr. Denton has no need for them anymore. One key witness was a Mrs. Ida Gregory, a personal friend of Louise from Denver. At the end of May, Mrs. Gregory and her daughter were in LA and accepted Louise's invitation to move in with her at the Catalina Street home. However, the plans changed abruptly with the excuse that it wasn't a good time because Mr. Denton was preparing to leave town. Finally, on the evening of June 3rd, Louise allowed Mrs. Gregory and her daughter into the house and revealed the real reason she couldn't come sooner. She said Denton had invited a Spanish woman to stay with him, and soon after her arrival, the two began arguing. During a particularly violent quarrel, Denton's companion produced a revolver and shot him in the arm. The next day, the couple left together and never came back. Mrs. Gregory said that Louise was a gracious host, and at no time did she seem off, but she had one strict condition. Neither she nor her daughter was to go into the basement under any circumstances. The Gregorys were guests in the house through the month of June and never saw Jacob Denton or the Spanish woman. To Denton's family, Louise told a slightly different version of the Spanish woman's story. She said that she happened to run into him in Los Angeles in mid-July and was astonished to discover that his arm had been amputated. Then she made an even more bizarre claim that he told her he had remarried and did not want anything to do with his family. One potentially damaging witness was gardener William Heitzman. Heitzman said that on the morning of June 3rd, Mrs. Peete instructed him to haul dirt from the flower beds into the space in the cellar where Denton's body was eventually found. When asked what she was going to do with the soil, Louise said, "I plan to grow mushrooms." By spinning a different version of events to everyone she met, Louise had indeed woven a tangled web. Now, under questioning, she realized that every word she uttered was only digging her in deeper. These weren't the Keystone Cops after all. The DA asserted that Louise Peete's motive for the murder was greed, and although the evidence against her was entirely circumstantial, he felt confident that the grand jury would indict her. And on the 27th of October, that is exactly what happened. Louise Peete's trial for the murder of Jacob Denton was scheduled to begin on January 21st, 1921, and the district attorney announced he would seek the death penalty.
There are those who look upon me as a vamp, but I would tell them all, I have only acted in the interest of others. I am sure that if Mr. Denton were here today, he would approve of everything I have done. I do, in fact, believe he is not dead and may have had reason for disappearing. I believe the Spanish woman could throw much light on this subject. Louise Peete, 1920.
On October 6th, a sedan pulled up to 675 Catalina Street, and out of it came Louise Peete, flanked by members of the district attorney's office. Again, the quiet neighborhood that had become a focal point for the curious was transformed into a circus. It was a preview of what was to come when the trial began. The public's interest in the Denton case had created a following around the so-called Enigma woman at its center. Hundreds of people jammed the street to catch a glimpse of her. Vendors sold photo postcards featuring her portrait for 10 cents apiece, and everyone had an opinion as to her guilt or innocence. Like a guide through a museum of the strange, Louise led the authorities from room to room, pointing out the places where the Spanish woman's story had unfolded. At last, they descended into the basement crypt where Jacob Denton's body had lain hidden for 4 months. All the while, her voice never faltered, nor did her face shift to betray any emotion. Of the late Mr. Denton, she claimed that for the entire time she knew him, he was constantly on guard against enemies whom he believed wanted him dead. They were supposedly people he had double-crossed in business, and the Spanish woman may have been among them. Speaking of her involvement in the affair, she said she had been an unwitting participant in an underworld plot that was already in motion before she stepped into the maelstrom. She maintained that it was nothing more than bad luck and unfortunate timing that caused events to turn against her. Louise's version of events was met with utter disbelief by the dead man's family, who described him as a decent, steady soul, devoted to his daughter and his beloved second wife, Dolly Mae. For the district attorney, the notion that Mrs. Peete would implicate a nameless, faceless Spanish woman seen by no one but herself strained all credulity. Despite her detractors, she remained steadfast throughout the tour. Her stoic facade broke only once upon leaving the scene, when a neighbor approached to express her support and faith in her innocence. Overcome, Louise wiped away tears as she said,
"This is the only kindness shown to me since my arrival here, and I thank you."
Of Los Angeles District Attorney Thomas L. Woolwine, however, she could barely restrain contempt. To the press, she complained,
"Mr. Woolwine has been conducting a bitter persecution and has not given me a fair opportunity to review the facts concerning my interest in this affair. Quite simply, I am being crucified."
However, as her trial date approached, new evidence came to light. The final autopsy report on Jacob Denton was released, announcing that he had died as a result of a single gunshot wound to the base of the skull. Furthermore, his body was intact, directly contradicting her claim that one arm had been amputated. To this revelation, Louise nonchalantly replied,
"Well then, Mr. Denton must have a double."
Blood evidence was discovered between the tiles of the kitchen floor. It identified the area beside the basement door as the point where the body fell, indicating that the killer had direct access to the location where the body was concealed. To explain the blood, Louise changed her story again. She said that on June 2nd, she was awakened at 2 a.m. by a loud argument in the kitchen. When she came downstairs to see what was happening, she said she witnessed Denton shoot the Spanish woman in the shoulder. Louise further claimed that she then helped the woman upstairs, where she bandaged her wound to stop the bleeding. It was yet another contradiction that strained her credibility. Before long, new details from her past began to surface, revealing a disturbing pattern of behavior and a series of improbable coincidences that slowly unraveled the image of an innocent wife and mother, allegedly persecuted for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. When Louise Peete was booked following her indictment for first-degree murder, she gave her age as 27. It was soon discovered that this was simply one more lie in a long pattern of falsehoods that had defined her life. Before she was taken to jail, she paused to speak with the press, her manner marked by charm and good humor. She began the interview with a request to photographers.
"I ask the gentleman with the cameras, no close-ups, please. They will show off my double chin."
The quip drew laughter, yet it carried an unintended irony. It revealed her savvy in managing her likeness just as she managed her history by concealing the flaws. But the past she had hoped was long dead and buried had already begun to claw its way into the present. According to the 1900 census, Loffie Louise Pressler was born on September 20th, 1887 in Bionville Parish, Louisiana, making her just 1 month past her 33rd birthday in the fall of 1920. However, other estimates place her age closer to 40. Much of her childhood remains unclear, but it appears she spent most of it moving between relatives and boarding schools, seemingly wearing out her welcome wherever she went. In 1904, Loffie, as she was known then, married a traveling salesman named Henry Bosley. By all accounts, it was a loveless marriage marked by frequent periods of separation. As their relationship soured, the couple moved to Dallas, Texas, where they stayed with the Faroot family, who were close friends of Henry. Shortly after their arrival, Louise became involved with the Faroots' 23-year-old son, Harry. What may have begun as a friendship quickly turned into infatuation that escalated into scandal. The fallout effectively ended Louise's marriage, and by 1910 Henry filed for divorce, accusing her of, among other things, cruel treatment and outrageous conduct. Following the divorce, Louise briefly stayed at a Dallas boarding house belonging to Benjamin and Lena Dobbs. When she left, one of Mrs. Dobbs' diamonds, valued at $700, went with her. In today's money, that's roughly $23,000. The jewel turned up at a pawn shop where it had been sold by the blindly devoted Harry Faroot for $90. Police tracked him to the Hotel St. George where he worked and questioned him about the transaction. Harry, unaware that the diamond was stolen, told them that Louise had asked him to sell it on her behalf. Confronted with the evidence, Louise admitted to taking the jewel, which was promptly returned to its owner. The Dobbses declined to press charges, and the episode was quietly dismissed as a misunderstanding. No arrests were made, and the matter was dropped. But the story did not end there. On Valentine's Day 1913, Harry Faroot was found in his room with a gunshot wound to the head. He died the following morning. His death was officially ruled a suicide, and it was widely assumed that he had been despondent over the harm done to his reputation by the diamond affair. Harry's family refused to accept that conclusion. They believed the evidence showed he had been murdered and that Louise was responsible. 7 years later, after noticing parallels with the Denton murder, they came forward in the hopes of having Harry's case reopened. Ultimately, however, their efforts failed. There were many other accusations from across the country implicating Louise in the theft of jewelry or cash. Most were apocryphal, but they all contributed to the growing legend of Louise Peete. Louise's trial began on January 19th, and from the very first day it was a spectacle. Fueled by relentless media coverage, the case had taken on a life of its own. The public swarmed the courthouse as though they had come to catch a glimpse of a movie star. On some days, the crowds grew so dense and unruly that riot police were summoned to keep the chaos at bay. At the heart of the uproar stood the mysterious defendant, her face obscured by the polka-dot veil she wore to court every day. She carried herself with a strange mixture of forbearance and vampish confidence, an aura the public equally interpreted as evidence of either innocence or guilt. One thing everyone could agree on was that she entered the courtroom like it was a stage, and she was its star. Despite the circus atmosphere outside the courthouse, District Attorney Woolwine conducted the prosecution as though he were condemning all the evil in the world embodied in a single woman. He portrayed a scenario all too familiar in the career of the light-fingered defendant, in which, after establishing herself in a new home, she began systematically plundering its valuables. He suggested that Denton caught her in the act and ordered her out of his house. But Louise, unwilling to abandon a gold mine, plotted and carried out his murder. In his closing argument, Woolwine compared her to a ghoul looting the body of Jacob Denton while it was still warm and blood poured from his head. As for the identity of the Spanish woman, Woolwine made it clear that it was the defendant, Louise Peete. Defense attorney Robert Scott attacked the circumstantial nature of the state's case, arguing that a person cannot be convicted merely because they had the opportunity to kill. He then reminded the jury that Louise was a mother, and that a mother is less likely to kill because she, above all, prizes life. If sympathy didn't work, he hoped to plant reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds by posing a practical question. How could a 145-pound, 5'3" woman drag the dead weight of a 6'1", 215-pound man down a narrow, twisting flight of cellar stairs, then wrap him in a shroud, secure it with rope tied in sailor's knots, and bury him, all by herself? The trial lasted 18 days, and on the eve of the verdict, Louise made the following statement.
The papers have been kind in declaring that I have not lost my nerve, yet I have lost a great deal in the course of this trial. I have lost my faith in my fellow man, and in his desire to be just. and should I be condemned, it will be by nothing more than the opinion of 12 men, a perilously slight foundation upon which to determine the destiny of a human soul. Louise Peete, 1921.
When the jury began deliberating on Saturday, February 5th, it took them 5.5 hours and 6 ballots before they found Louise Peete guilty of the murder of Jacob Denton. In the end, they spared her from execution and sentenced her to life in prison. She was never quoted publicly whether that act of mercy restored her faith in her fellow man. When the verdict was read, it was Mr. Peete who broke down sobbing. Other than comforting her husband, Louise showed no emotion at all. She remained the enigma woman to the very end, choosing to leave the stage as she had lived her life, offering the world only her cold, silent, veiled, and impenetrable exterior. However, she did not remain silent for long. 3 years into Louise Peete's life sentence, a Los Angeles reporter paid her a visit at San Quentin. He found her still bristling with anger over the outcome of her trial and the way she'd been treated by the press.
I don't trust newspapermen. They are not fair. They go about hashing and gossiping like a half-deaf and two-tongued old woman retailing morbid half-truths. Someone just recently printed that I had confessed to murdering Mr. Denton. Well, I tell you, it's false. I never in my life made any confession. I have nothing to confess. I was convicted on purely circumstantial evidence. They forced me into a role of silence when I wanted to talk. I was a fool, and now I'm in here for God knows how long. Probably for the rest of my life. Louise Peete, 1924.
Her fate would be decided by time and the shifting tides of public opinion. Louise Peete adapted quickly to prison life while cultivating a complicated public image. Growing comfortable with the press, she spoke openly about her confinement and the crime for which she'd been convicted. However, no two tellings of her story were ever the same. Some versions even bordered on the fantastic. Yet the one detail she never wavered on was her innocence. By 1926, she abandoned her often stated belief that Jacob Denton was still alive with a stunning announcement involving the unsolved murder of William Desmond Taylor. She said the silent film actor and director was assassinated because he was about to name Mr. Denton's true killers. None of her theories were ever validated. However, Louise had a knack for playing on people's sympathies and drawing them to her cause. It was also the era when the women's suffrage movement culminated with the passage of the 19th Amendment, empowering women and opening a greater awareness of their plight. The timing also dovetailed with the trial, especially since Louise had been convicted by an all-male jury. This strengthened her supporters' belief that the system had treated her unfairly because she was a woman, and it galvanized their long-term commitment to securing her freedom. Her apologists, however, never bothered to explain or even acknowledge the many times she had changed her story. She had tried and failed to get a new trial. Therefore, short of Jacob Denton crawling out of his grave to exonerate her, Louise would have to wait at least 7 years before becoming eligible for parole. Those years passed slowly, and she helplessly watched through iron bars as the life she knew was washed away by time. The first to go was her husband Richard, who had stood loyally by her side during the trial. After her conviction, he quietly returned to Denver, where he was granted a divorce. He tried to raise his daughter Betty by himself, but in fact he was a dying man. For years he had battled tuberculosis, and the ordeal had taken a toll on him physically. On August 23, 1924, Richard Peete checked into a hotel in Tucson, Arizona under an assumed name and took his own life. Louise was said to have been saddened by the news, but was thankful that his suffering was over. After Louise's conviction, little Betty Peete was placed in an orphanage where her last name was changed by court order to shield her from the notoriety surrounding the trial. Mother and daughter managed to exchange letters, but as time passed, their correspondence became less frequent until it ceased altogether. Years passed before they had any further contact. Louise often said that she would have the last laugh, and it may have been with a sense of satisfaction that she watched the career of prosecutor Thomas Woolwine, whom she once described as having cruelty etched onto his face, go down in flames. Woolwine had used her conviction as a stepping stone to launch a political career, one that ended spectacularly with a failed run for governor of California in 1922. After the defeat, his troubles got worse. Back in Los Angeles, he faced a recall effort aimed at removing him as district attorney. Although the effort was abandoned, Woolwine retired, citing health reasons, and planned a comeback. However, fate intervened, and the colorful former DA succumbed to liver failure in July 1925. Louise's reaction to his untimely demise can only be imagined. In December 1928, after serving the requisite 7 years, Louise made her first plea to the parole board, begging for release on the grounds that her daughter had gone missing. Her request was denied, as were the next 8 over the course of 11 years. In 1933, Louise got a new home when she was transferred to the recently built California State Institution for Women in Tehachapi. Her years inside were not idle. She set about reshaping her image as a model prisoner through small acts of goodwill. She cooked for other inmates and made gifts for children at Christmas time. She also joined a prison theatrical program where her singing voice drew high praise. Gradually, she gave up on conspiracies, complaints, and outrageous claims of innocence, choosing instead to humble herself in the hope that patience and effort might one day serve her cause. Then in 1939, she filed her 10th parole request, and in April, it was approved. There was one condition to her release: that she have a job. It was a requirement that her legion of supporters happily satisfied. However, she would have to take on a career as a housekeeper. It was a designation she had long resented, but one she was willing to suffer as long as it meant her freedom. With employment secured, Louise stepped out of the prison gates and took her first breath as a free woman in 18 years. There were no friends or relatives to greet her. The 4 newspaper men who were on hand said that she sobbed bitterly as she walked to a waiting car. She did not answer their questions and instead handed them a prepared statement.
19 years ago, I pleaded not guilty to murder. I still plead not guilty. After having served 18.5 years in bondage for a crime I did not commit, I would appreciate the opportunity to re-establish myself without further publicity. I appreciate the parole and shall not violate the faith placed in me. Louise Peete, 1939.
As Louise Peete's car drove away on that brilliant spring afternoon, neither the California Department of Corrections nor the probation officer had any reason to doubt the sincerity of the promise she had made. Mrs. Annie Lee Judson, formerly known as Louise Peete, waited in the district attorney's office in downtown Los Angeles. For the second time in her life, she was under arrest, and her mind was in overdrive, thinking of how to talk her way out of being sent back to prison. She was confident that she could explain everything, just as long as they didn't find the little secret she had buried in the backyard. When the phone rang, the DA's chief investigator answered it, and after a short exchange, he gave Louise a gotcha stare. Within 5 minutes, they were in a car headed back to Pacific Palisades. The small house on Hampton Place belonged to Andrew and Margaret Logan, Louise's longtime friends and benefactors. For the last year, she had been employed by Mrs. Logan as a housekeeper and nurse for her ailing husband. When the car pulled up, the house was a hive of activity. Policemen tramped across the lawn and through the flower beds as neighbors watched from a distance. As Louise and the DA's man pushed their way into the crowded front room, her gaze immediately fixed on the face of Lee Judson, her husband of 6 months. When his eyes met hers, she read through the pale confusion of his expression and knew that he saw her as a stranger. At that moment, a voice called out, referring to her as Mrs. Peete, the name that she'd hoped to keep buried. The voice belonged to LA District Attorney Fred Hauser, who was beckoning her to come outside to see what they found in the garden. Turning her gaze away from the sad visage of her husband, Louise was escorted into the backyard, where floodlights glared down upon a freshly dug hole, exposing a shallow grave. At the sight of it, she immediately covered her eyes. With a quizzical air, District Attorney Hauser asked if she would take a look, but she begged not to be made to see it. He pressed her further, asking whether she knew who was buried there, whether it was her friend Margaret Logan. Louise shook her head and claimed she did not know who it was, though the shrewd prosecutor recognized the lie at once. Hauser followed Louise back into the house. He could see she was rattled and had already given clues to her guilt. He was confident that she was close to confessing. He asked her directly if she killed Mrs. Logan. She responded that she didn't kill anybody. He followed with a question on how she died. Louise said she did not know. Then he asked who buried her in the backyard. Again, the response was she did not know. Hauser shifted his attention to her husband and demanded to know how he was involved in the matter. Louise snapped with insistence that he knew nothing at all. Unrelenting, Hauser pressed further, asking whether Mr. Judson had merely helped bury the body or if he had killed Mrs. Logan. Louise stiffened and fixed the district attorney with a hard glare, vehemently denying the mere suggestion of it. She insisted that Mr. Judson was innocent of everything, then catching herself, hastily qualified the claim. She was not admitting to anything, she said, but wanted it to be clear that her husband was blameless. She continued that he had not even known her true identity when they married. Seizing on the opening, Hauser asked if she meant that she alone had killed Mrs. Logan. The question was designed to unsettle her, but Louise remained composed. She stalled, saying that if she were allowed to tell the story in her own way, she would not even hire an attorney. She would go straight into court, and there would be no need for a trial at all. At once, the prosecutor demanded whether she intended to enter court and plead guilty to the murder of Mrs. Logan. Louise accused him of twisting her words and said that if only he would allow her to write a full statement, it would clear everything up. But Hauser had no intention of relenting or giving her time to concoct a story. Resolved to hold both her and Mr. Judson on suspicion of murder, he transferred them downtown, where the questioning would continue non-stop through the night and into the next day. What they would uncover was the true heart of darkness. By 1944, Louise had a long history with the Logans. They met on a business trip to Singapore in 1919. Later, when Louise was on trial for the murder of Jacob Denton, the Logans took care of 4-year-old Betty Peete. After her conviction, the Logans were firmly convinced she had been the victim of a grave miscarriage of justice, and while she served out her sentence, Mrs. Logan remained on the front lines in the campaign to secure her release. For many years, Margaret Logan was a pioneering real estate agent in the growing Los Angeles market. During World War II, she moonlighted at the Douglas Aircraft Company. However, that ended in 1943 when her husband Arthur was diagnosed with a form of dementia. The onset was marked by steadily declining health, making it increasingly difficult for Margaret to balance her career with caring for him. At the time, Louise was in the custody of Emily Latham, her close friend and former parole officer. In September 1943, Louise was present at Mrs. Latham's bedside when she died suddenly. Her passing was later confirmed to be from natural causes, but wherever Louise Peete went, death seemed to follow. The timing was, in its own way, almost too perfect. Margaret Logan needed help caring for Arthur, and Louise needed someone willing to assume custody under the conditions of her parole. An arrangement was made, and by October, Louise was settled in the Logans' home, where everything went smoothly, at first. In late May 1944, a relative of Arthur Logan received an unsettling phone call from Louise. She spoke with growing concern about Arthur's declining mental state and feared that he was becoming increasingly unmanageable. Without citing any specific incident, she underscored the seriousness of the situation with an ominous warning.
Something must be done about Arthur, or I fear you will wake one morning and read in the papers about a terrible tragedy.
Louise was then living with her husband, Lee Jetson, in a small apartment in Glendale, California. On Saturday, May 27th, she called to tell him that she would not be home when he got off work because Margaret Logan needed her help with Arthur. Mr. Jetson waited until 9:30 that evening before calling the Logan residence. Louise answered and told him the shocking news that Mr. Logan had brutally attacked Mrs. Logan, beating her and biting her on the neck and face, leaving her in, quote, terrible shape, unquote. The following morning, Mr. Jetson went to Pacific Palisades and was horrified by what he found. There were bloodstains on the back of an upholstered chair and a large pool of blood on the living room rug. Louise had cuts on her hands, which she claimed she sustained while trying to separate Mr. Logan from his wife. Mrs. Logan was not at home when Mr. Jetson arrived. Louise explained that she had gone to the hospital because of her injuries and would likely be away for quite some time. As for Mr. Logan, Louise had given him a heavy dose of tranquilizers, and he was fast asleep. On June 1st, Louise appeared with Arthur before the Los Angeles Lunacy Commission, identifying herself as his foster sister. She described the brutal attack in detail and insisted that Arthur's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer be cared for at home. Based on the allegations, a competency hearing was held on June 5th, with Louise appearing as the sole witness. Notably absent from the proceeding was Mrs. Logan. Louise explained that she was recovering from her injuries. However, she submitted as evidence a statement allegedly written by her. The commission ordered Arthur held for observation, and within a few days he was transferred to Patton State Hospital, where he would spend the remaining 6 months of his life. With Margaret and Arthur out of the way and their Pacific Palisades home now vacant, Louise and her unsuspecting husband moved in. She told the neighbors that Margaret had gone to be near Arthur and was not likely to ever return. And since the Logans were a childless couple with no close family ties, no one asked any questions. For Louise, everything had fallen into place, or so it seemed. Now entering her twilight years, she believed she had finally attained the life she always wanted and deserved. However, any contentment she might have found in her home by the sea must have been unsettled by the knowledge that it was all built on lies. She could not bury the fact that she was a convicted murderer free on parole, whose paradise could at any moment be toppled by a gentle ocean breeze. It was was an alleged act of forgery that put Louise back on the radar of law enforcement. Beginning in June 1944, an eagle-eyed parole officer noticed that Margaret Logan's signature on Louise's parole slips did not match earlier examples. After spending several months quietly compiling evidence, the parole board sent it to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. The DA found the material compelling enough to launch the December 20th raid. Ironically, it wasn't until the raid that the police became aware that Margaret Logan had disappeared around the same time the alleged forgeries began. Once the investigation turned to murder, evidence of a separate act of fraud emerged, one the district attorney believed may have precipitated the killing. In May 1944, Mrs. Logan's bank notified her that a $200 check bearing her forged signature had been deposited into an account controlled by Louise. Witnesses at the bank reported that Mrs. Logan was furious and demanded that Louise repay the money or face having her parole revoked. Louise denied any fraud had taken place. She explained that it was a misunderstanding by the bank and that Mrs. Logan had routinely allowed her to sign checks on her behalf. The check, she said, was repayment for money Mrs. Logan owed her. What actually transpired between the two old friends remains unknown. What is known, however, is that after May 1944, Margaret Logan was never seen alive again. Within days of the discovery of Mrs. Logan's body, an autopsy determined that she'd been shot in the back of the neck, just below the base of the skull. The bullet passed through her neck and exited through her mouth, shattering several teeth. It was later found embedded in the wall. However, the gunshot wound was not fatal. The examination revealed that her skull had been fractured by blunt force trauma, which was determined to be the cause of death. Perhaps it was knowing what the medical examiner's report would say, coupled with a desire to protect her husband, that caused Louise to change the story she had given on the night of her arrest. In a harrowing 9-page statement, she made two shocking claims. First, that Arthur Logan had murdered his wife in a fit of rage, and second, that she had buried Mrs. Logan's body in the backyard. She wrote that on the afternoon of May 27th, she and the Logans were preparing to go to the beach when Margaret went back into the house to answer a phone call. When Arthur realized his wife was no longer with them, he grew irritated and followed her inside. A few moments later, Louise heard Margaret calling for help. Louise rushed into the house and found Arthur on top of his wife, striking her repeatedly on the back of the head with a pistol he had somehow gotten a hold of. Louise added that she tried to pull him off, but he turned on her and bit her on the hand. After what felt like an eternity, he finally collapsed from exhaustion. Only then did Louise manage to give him a large dose of tranquilizers and put him to bed. Louise said that Margaret was barely alive when she returned to the living room. Knowing that the friend she thought of as a sister was slipping away, she knelt on the floor and cradled her head until she stopped breathing. It was then that Louise realized she was faced with a predicament. Believing no one would accept her story once they found out who she was, she decided to bury Mrs. Logan in the flower bed. Louise handed over the document, convinced it would absolve both her and her husband of murder. But District Attorney Hauser saw it differently. He called the statement pure dynamite and was confident that Louise had just handed him the very rope with which she would hang herself.
Time and time again, I walked with Mr. Judson along the cliffs over the sea at night. We would walk beyond all the warning signs to the very edge, and I would think, why can't the ground just give way and let it all be blotted out? It would have settled everything, and he would never have to know. Louise Peete, 1944.
In the days following her arrest, Louise's thoughts were consumed by her husband. She tearfully expressed regret for keeping her notorious past hidden from him. She lamented that he never knew how deeply she had suffered and how many times she had tried and failed to tell him, but was unable to summon the courage. She admitted that she would have rather seen them both meet a sudden and tragic end, sparing him from the pain of discovering the truth. But once her secret was revealed and he had been swept into the tempest, she devoted all her energy to convincing the district attorney of his innocence. Then on January 11th, 1945, following a 2-day preliminary hearing, Municipal Judge William Byrne dismissed the charges against Lee Judson in the death of Margaret Logan, citing insufficient evidence. Thank God, Louise cried out in the courtroom as the decision was announced. For the mild-mannered, soft-spoken 67-year-old who had never broken a single law in his life, it marked the end of a nearly month-long ordeal that had completely turned his life upside down. Prior to his release, he spoke to the press about his bewilderment at the entire affair. He said that up until his arrest, he had known his wife as Lou Ann Lee. He also believed that Margaret Logan had, as his wife told him, gone away to a hospital for plastic surgery following her husband's attack. He explained that after moving into the Logan house, he insisted on taking over all of the household expenses. Mr. Judson had the blood-stained carpet and chair cleaned and reupholstered. When his wife wanted a raised flower bed in the garden, he hired a local workman to complete the job. He had no idea it covered Mrs. Logan's grave. He even began the process of transferring ownership of the house to Louise because she told him it was what the Logans wanted. At no time did he feel any inkling to question anything that his wife wanted until the very end, or as he put it, quote, when 7 men burst through the door and arrested me and Mrs. Judson, end quote. He admitted that he was just plain gullible for not seeing through her subterfuge. However, he said that even after all he had been through, he couldn't think ill of Louise, adding that during the time they were together, she was the kindest, most gentle woman in the world. When Judge Byrne set Mr. Judson free, Louise may have believed that it meant she too was about to be exonerated, but the thought soon perished once she learned that she would be held over for trial on a charge of first-degree murder. When the proceedings were over, she turned to watch the frail, thin figure of her husband, aged beyond his years, as he left the courtroom, flanked by his son and daughter. Her frown deepened as he disappeared through the doorway. He never once looked back at her. It was a Friday afternoon when a thin, elderly man arrived alone at the Broadway Arcade building in downtown Los Angeles. He rode the elevator to the 12th floor. Moments later, C.J. Pierce, the building manager, heard a loud crash. Following the sound to the stairwell landing between the 4th and 5th floors, he discovered the crumpled body of a man who had apparently jumped to his death. The only form of identification found on the body was the initials LBJ stamped into the leather sweatband of his hat. There was no note. The deceased was later identified as Mr. Lee Borden Judson by a detective working on the Logan case. It was noted that the time on his broken wristwatch was 2:12 p.m. It had been less than 24 hours since he had been cleared of charges. Later that same afternoon, Louise was summoned to the office of the women's jail matron. As she was escorted to the meeting, Louise knew it was bad news, and she felt fairly certain she knew what it was. After all, she'd been through it once before. When the door opened and she saw the stony-faced Mrs. Veda Sullivan Russell, it confirmed it for her. Louise raised her hand before the statuesque jail matron could speak. I know, she said. You want to tell me that the DA is going to demand the death penalty." Mrs. Russell looked at Louise pitifully. "No, dear," she replied. "What would you say if I told you that your husband is no more?" It took Louise a moment to fully comprehend the message in Mrs. Russell's question. But once she was told that Mr. Judson had taken his own life, she broke down and admitted that she had sensed something terrible was bound to happen. Through tears, she said her husband was a decent man who could not live with disgrace. She said she often staged small quarrels, half hoping he would leave her, but he never did. He insisted that he could not go on without her, and she could not make him understand that she was trying to protect him. She reflected sorrowfully that she had driven Mr. Judson to his death, though she was quick to add that the district attorney bore equal responsibility for the baseless prosecution of an innocent man. Finally, with her voice choked with grief, she remarked that he had chosen an awful way to die, and she hoped he hadn't suffered. Then, with a heavy sigh, she said at the very least she was thankful that he was spared from the humiliation that the trial would have caused him. At her arraignment, she asked that the murder complaint list her simply as Louise Peete, omitting any mention of Judson to spare her late husband's family further disgrace. She believed that severing any remaining association between them was the only gesture of kindness she could offer. The tragic suicide of Lee Judson cemented the Black Widow label that has clung to Louise Peete ever since. Though the body count has been embellished over the past 80 years, the grim truth remains unchanged that anyone who found themselves caught in her web rarely lived to tell the tale. With her second murder trial set to begin in May 1945, reporters asked her how she felt about a favorable outcome. Pitifully, she shrugged and announced,
"I don't care what happens now." I can't feel anything about the crimes of which I am accused because I am simply not guilty. Louise Peete, 1945.
Louise's second murder trial did not promise to be the spectacle that the first one had been. After a quarter century, the public's perception of her had drastically shifted. She was no longer the enigmatic Spider-Woman or the violet-eyed siren who drew admirers like a Hollywood vixen. She was now seen as a middle-aged ex-con who still had prison yard dirt under her fingernails, or as a cautionary tale for a penal system that many believed had grown too lenient. Abandoned by her former legion of admirers, the only souls left in her corner were her court-appointed public defenders. The change in sentiment was summed up by 90-year-old Henry Peabody, a juror from Louise's first murder trial. He told the Pasadena Star-News that in 1921 the jury had voted against the death penalty because the evidence was circumstantial. He added that if he had known she would be paroled, he would have sent her to the gallows. Opening arguments began on May 2, 1945. While Louise continued to vigorously proclaim her innocence, the prosecution described the similarities between the deaths of Jacob Denton and Margaret Logan as both striking and damning. It was alleged that she, 1, gained prior access to the victims' homes to ascertain their wealth and how to acquire it, 2, employed a similar method of killing by shooting the victims in the base of the skull to sever the spinal cord, 3, buried or concealed the victims on their own property, 4, appropriated the victims' estates after their deaths through forgery, deception, and financial exploitation, 5, fabricated cover stories that implicated third parties as the killers, 6, provided elaborate and shifting accounts that were contradicted by the physical evidence. The prosecutor argued that the parallels were too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. He went on to allege that the only difference was the choice of her second victim. 24 years had passed, giving Louise ample time to brood over where she had gone wrong. Jacob Denton was a widower who lived alone, but he had family members who depended on him and relentlessly pried into her affairs until she was forced to flee back to Colorado. After that, it was only a matter of time before Denton's basement tomb was discovered. The Logans, by contrast, were childless and had no close relatives to come snooping around and asking questions. Arthur was elderly, ill, and not in his right mind, which made it easy to have him legally committed to a mental institution. And because the Logans kept mainly to themselves, no one realized Margaret was missing until her backyard grave was discovered. The prosecutor reminded the jury that the Logans were Louise's dearest friends, yet she was quoted as saying that she could not feel anything about their deaths. To illustrate the defendant's lack of remorse, he called Edith Fish, who recounted an unsettling incident that occurred shortly before Louise's arrest in December 1944. Mrs. Fish, who lived next door to the Logans, received a telegram announcing the death of Arthur Logan at Patton State Hospital. Realizing that the message had been misdelivered, she brought it over at once to Louise, knowing that Mrs. Logan had been away for many months. According to the witness, Louise glanced at the telegram, then told her that she wanted to show her something. Louise rushed into her room and returned carrying several hats. She then began trying them on one by one while performing what the witness described as a little dance. Noticing how startled Mrs. Fish appeared at the bizarre display, Louise stopped and remarked that she hoped Mrs. Fish did not think she was selecting a hat to wear to Arthur Logan's funeral. Other witnesses testified that Louise repurposed clothing that had belonged to Margaret Logan to suit her own needs. They also described how she disposed of or gave away items belonging to the Logans that she did not want. One of those witnesses was Laura Barnes, the daughter of Lee Judson, who testified that Louise portrayed herself as a wealthy woman and even offered her the gift of an automobile. Several times during the trial, Louise interrupted the proceedings with outbursts, accusing the witnesses and the prosecutor of lying. Then, on May 16th, Louise took the stand in her own defense. She maintained that Arthur Logan had killed his wife and that her actions were those of a frightened woman trying to protect herself from suspicion rather than those of a murderer. She described Mr. Logan's mental state, alleging that he had become violent around the time she began working in the Logan household. She said that he often hit and kicked his wife, leaving her covered in bruises. According to Louise, she had tried to persuade Margaret to have Arthur committed to an asylum as early as November 1943. She then recounted the gruesome death scene, describing how Mr. Logan attacked his wife with a meat hammer and his mouth, biting her and tearing flesh away with his teeth. She also claimed that he bludgeoned her with a revolver, which discharged with each blow, sending bullets across the room and one through Margaret's head. The prosecution refuted her account, arguing that the doctors who examined Mr. Logan all agreed that he showed no signs of violent behavior. Furthermore, the autopsy revealed no bite marks anywhere on Mrs. Logan's face or body, and only one bullet was recovered from the scene. As the prosecution sought to link the Denton case to the current one, Louise reaffirmed her innocence in his murder and insisted that for all she knew, Jacob Denton was still very much alive somewhere. On her last day on the witness stand, the deputy district attorney hammered her credibility by questioning her about forging documents and lying about Margaret Logan undergoing plastic surgery when she knew full well the woman was dead. Louise replied that every story she had told was intended to prolong the investigation and protect Mr. Judson, whom she insisted was innocent. In his closing argument, the prosecutor declared that the death penalty was the only fitting punishment for Louise Peete, warning that it would be a travesty to return her to prison merely to serve out her existing life sentence. The defense attorney countered that the state's attempt to connect the Denton murder to Margaret Logan's was feeble at best. He asked the jury to consider why, if Louise had murdered Denton, she would have, after 24 years of planning, reenacted a crime that had already failed the first time. The matter of Louise Peete's life or death rested with the jury for 3 hours and 11 minutes. When she walked into the courtroom to hear the verdict, it was noted that she had been reading a book of Chinese philosophy titled The Importance of Living. She sat motionless at the counsel table as the guilty verdict was read, along with the recommendation of the jury of 11 women and 1 man that she receive the ultimate penalty of death. The verdict had come exactly 1 year to the day after Margaret Logan's murder. Before being returned to her jail cell, she met with Chief Jail Matron Veda Russell, the woman who had earlier broken the news of her husband's death. Without emotion, Louise said,
"I'm going home, Vada. I knew halfway through I would be found guilty. It's too bad that Margaret Logan wasn't in the courtroom to see how unjust that verdict was."
On the 28th of January 1947, with all of her appeals exhausted, Superior Court Judge Harold Landreth pronounced the death sentence upon Louise Peete. The condemned was not present for the legal formality that set the date of her execution 73 days hence. A small group of reporters waited outside the office of the superintendent of the California State Institution for Women. They could clearly hear Louise Peete raging inside. It was the eve of her transfer from Tehachapi to San Quentin's death row, but that was not what had upset her. She was furious about a story that had appeared in a local newspaper concerning the discovery of a razor blade hidden in her cell. The article suggested that she had intended to use it on herself if her final appeal failed. The journalist listened as the condemned woman ranted that the story was a lie, that the press did not care about her, and that she wanted nothing to do with them. Finally, her voice quieted, and they waited for nearly half an hour. Then, just as they began to think they had wasted a trip into the middle of nowhere, the office door opened and Louise Peete stepped out. They were surprised to see her smiling, and instead of berating them, she greeted each journalist warmly as though nothing at all had happened. Under one arm, she carried a large box of candy. The reporters exchanged bewildered glances at her sudden change in mood, but Louise soon put them at ease. She remained in high spirits throughout what one Los Angeles newspaper described as her next-to-last grand gesture.
I am not afraid to die,
she said calmly as she passed around the box of candy to her visitors.
I am reconciled. I have found peace. I am ready.
She reaffirmed her innocence, stating that she had never committed an aggressive act in her life. When asked how she coped with knowing what awaited her, she grinned sardonically.
Death is an indelicate subject. Of course, one must adjust oneself to the exigencies. I always have during a rather eventful lifetime.
But Louise did not expect to be put to death. She had pinned her hopes on executive clemency and was confident she would be spared at the last moment.
Governor Warren is a gentleman, and a gentleman would not send a lady to die in the gas chamber.
For the remainder of the visit, Louise entertained her guests with stories from her life. They would later write about her calmness and pleasant demeanor, and how she played the role of hostess so well that it seemed as though they were there to see her off on a long vacation rather than a brief journey to oblivion. When the interview was over, she made sure everyone had sampled the candies before she was taken back to her cell. After she was gone, an attendant observed, "Louise is a truly wonderful person. Isn't it a shame that such a woman has the habit of murdering people?" Later that day, California Governor Earl Warren issued a brief statement in response to Louise's gentleman remarks. He said, "As much as I regret seeing a woman go to her death, I can find absolutely no grounds for reprieve." Warden Clinton Duffy saw Louise mouth the words, "Let's go," through the window of the gas chamber. At 10:03 a.m., he signaled the executioner, who pulled a small lever. Beneath the death chair, sodium cyanide pellets fell into a bath of sulfuric acid. The resulting chemical reaction released hydrogen cyanide gas into the chamber. As she inhaled the poison, it entered her bloodstream, depriving her cells of the ability to use oxygen and setting in motion the failure of her brain, heart, and other vital organs. She had only minutes left. In the viewing area, the spectators held their breath. They watched as Louise coughed, then suddenly and violently threw her head back. The mechanical thrumming of the electric fans muffled any sounds that might have come from the death cell. Her body convulsed and struggled against the leather restraints that bound her to the seat. Gasping, Louise's head pitched forward, and then, after what seemed like an eternity, gradually slumped until her chin rested upon her chest. At 10:13 a.m. on Friday, April 11th, 1947, Louise Peete was dead. Silently, the witnesses dispersed. Lucille Schoen, San Quentin's chief nurse who had been at Louise's side in the hours before her execution, later wrote that everyone present would never be the same, and that when they left the death house, they all felt older, sadder, and deeply ashamed. Mima Snodgrass, the spiritual advisor for the Los Angeles County Jail, was there to receive Louise's body. She had it placed in a plain steel gray coffin and transported by hearse from San Quentin to Los Angeles. The transfer was made in the dead of night with only a handful of people present. Her final journey back to Los Angeles was a grim repeat of the car ride that had begun her parole in 1939. By dawn, her remains had arrived at Rosedale Cemetery for cremation. A private burial followed. Present was Betty, her long-estranged daughter. Now a married mother of 4, Betty was accompanied by her eldest daughter, 9-year-old Sandra. There was no service and no flowers. Only a short, simple prayer was offered for her soul. Afterward, she was buried in an unmarked grave. When it was over, it seemed as though a guilty world wished to be rid of Louise Peete and erase any memory that she had ever walked upon its surface.
One must adjust oneself to the exigencies. I always have, during a rather eventful lifetime.
Time has erased the places where Louise Peete committed her crimes. Jacob Denton's lovely Tudor home was demolished long ago to make way for Los Angeles's Ambassador Hotel. The Logan's cozy Pacific Palisades residence, where Louise played house for 6 months, survived into the first quarter of the 21st century before being destroyed in the fires of January 2025. In fact, the only landmarks that bear witness to her time on Earth are the graves of her victims. Jacob Denton was laid to rest at Hollywood Forever Cemetery beside his beloved second wife, Dolly Mae, and Martha, the infant daughter from his first marriage. By all accounts, Denton was a man who loved life. He was by no means a saint, but he cared deeply for those closest to him, especially his daughter Frances, as evidenced by the inscription on his headstone. It is fitting that he rests among so many celebrated personalities who, like him, lived life to its fullest and experienced it at its most tragic. Today, the almost human cries of peacocks echo through the cemetery, singing a mournful serenade for the dead. One wonders whether Louise ever visited his grave, either to seek absolution or to exult in her release from prison. In a quiet section of Mountain View Cemetery in Altadena, a single flat headstone marks the end of Arthur and Margaret Logan's shared journey. They led simple, unremarkable lives defined by goodness and generosity, traits that would ultimately prove fatal. For 25 years, Louise was part of their lives. They trusted in her innocence. They cared for her daughter during her first murder trial. They helped secure her freedom. They gave her work and welcomed her into their home. By the time they learned who she truly was, it was already too late to stop what had begun. According to lore, Lee Judson's ashes are buried in an undisclosed location within Grandview Memorial Park in Glendale, California. It has been suggested that he married Louise out of fear of dying alone. One can only speculate about the moral compromises he may have made to that end. Although he was ultimately cleared of charges, his death left lingering questions. More than 50 friends and relatives carried him to his bier, the burden of their task made heavier by doubts over whether he was truly the upright man they thought they knew.
Every little breeze seems to whisper Louise. Birds in the trees seem to twitter Louise. Each little rose tells me it knows I love.
A great deal has been written about Louise. Some of it is true, but much of it is not. She had 3 documented marriages, but contrary to popular belief, not all of her husbands took their own lives. Henry Bosley, her first husband, survived 6 years of marriage to Louise. After their divorce in 1910, he remarried, raised a family, and spent the rest of his life trying to hide from his past. There is also the question of how many murders she actually committed. Officially, the count stands at 2, Jacob Denton in 1920 and Margaret Logan in 1944. Wikipedia, the citadel of dubious facts, further muddies the record with a story claiming that Louise shot and killed a wealthy oil baron named Joe Appel in Waco, Texas, and escaped prosecution by successfully arguing self-defense. However, no contemporary account of such a sensational event has been found. Furthermore, there is no evidence that an oil man named Joe Appel ever existed. Wikipedia cites a 2010 book whose author made the allegation without identifying a source. The story is most likely a hybrid of the Jacob Denton and Harry Faroot cases, aided by the author's fertile imagination. Unless solid evidence to the contrary surfaces, it will remain this narrator's humble opinion that the incident never occurred. It is possible that Louise's true number of victims was higher. Harry Faroot's family certainly believed so, even though they were unable to convince anyone else. But her wickedness requires no embellishment. Warden Clinton Duffy, who knew Louise from the time she first arrived at San Quentin in 1921, said that she projected an air of innocent sweetness that concealed a heart of ice. Of all the criminals he encountered during his career, Duffy claimed that Louise Peete was the only one who made his blood run cold. As bad as Louise was, it must be noted that she was not unloved. A series of fascinating comments left by 2 of Louise's grandchildren on a blog post offers a rare glimpse into the life of the killer's daughter. Betty Peete was 5 years old when she was separated from her family. Yet according to her children, she maintained a relationship with her mother over the years and was present at her burial. Betty married twice and had 4 children of her own. She was a dressmaker by trade who wrote poetry in her spare time. She lived long enough to become both a grandmother and a great-grandmother. When she died in 1991 at the age of 75, she remained convinced that her mother was innocent of murder. Betty's own children, however, did not share her belief. They saw through Louise's lies but chose not to challenge their mother's convictions. Instead, they lived with the silent dread that the darkness that had consumed their grandmother might someday reawaken in one of her descendants. Louise Peete crept onto the world stage like a monster from the pages of a fairy tale. She destroyed everything she touched and left fear in her wake. Her resting place at Angelus Rosedale Cemetery is barren and forlorn, as though her very essence had poisoned the ground itself. No headstone marks her grave, but the more sensitive passerby will know the place. It may reveal itself through a sudden perceptible drop in temperature, or the wanderer may find themselves gripped by the unsettling feeling they are not alone. It is said that evil has the power to defy death. If Louise's spirit still walks this ground, it would be wise for those who come here to tread lightly and listen for the stirring of leaves, for some dangers cannot be seen.
Wonderful, oh it's wonderful to be in love with you. Beautiful, you're so beautiful, you haunt me all day through. Every little breeze seems to whisper Louise, birds in the trees seem to twitter Louise. Each little rose tells me it knows I love you, love you. Every little beat that I feel in my heart seems to repeat what I felt at the start. Each little sigh tells me that I adore you, Louise.